Some prices are so small they fool the world into thinking the thing being sold has no value at all. But sometimes, the cheapest purchase becomes the most expensive mistake evil men ever make. The auctioneer struck the wooden platform twice with his cane, and the noise echoed across the dusty square like the closing of a coffin lid. By noon, the heat had settled over Dry Creek like a heavy blanket. Horses shifted impatiently beside hitching posts. Flies circled empty whiskey bottles. Men in sweat-stained hats laughed louder than they needed to, eager to prove that nothing could surprise them anymore. They had already bought cattle. They had already bought horses. Now they were buying people. The line of prisoners stood beneath the faded awning with iron chains linking their wrists. Some stared at the ground. Others looked beyond the crowd toward the distant hills, as though freedom still existed somewhere past the endless horizon. At the end of the line stood a young native woman. Unlike the others, she refused to lower her eyes. Dust clung to her dark braided hair. A bruise colored one side of her cheek. The leather cord around her neck had been left untouched by her captors, though whatever once hung from it had long since disappeared. She stood perfectly still, not defeated, waiting. Apache girl, the auctioneer shouted with a grin. Healthy, strong, knows horses, knows the land. Starts at $20. Silence answered him. Someone in the crowd snorted. I wouldn't pay 20 cents. Another voice laughed. She'd probably stab you before supper. The square erupted with amusement. The auctioneer tried again. $10. No one moved. The woman never blinked. She looked at every face with the calm certainty of someone who had already judged them all. One by one, the bidders drifted away. Nobody wanted trouble. Nobody wanted an Apache. The auctioneer wiped sweat from his forehead. $5. Still nothing. A tumbleweed rolled lazily across the empty street, while the wind carried the distant creak of an old sign swinging above the saloon. Then another voice broke the silence. 2. Heads turned together. Standing near the back of the crowd was Ethan Walker. His clothes carried the pale dust of long cattle drives. His boots had seen too many winters. The brim of his weathered hat hid tired blue eyes that seemed more interested in people than in proving themselves. He stepped forward without hurry. $2. The laughter exploded. Walker finally lost his mind. For $2, I'd rather buy another shovel. You'll regret bringing that savage home. Ethan ignored every word. He simply reached into his pocket, placed 2 worn silver coins into the auctioneer's palm, and waited. The chains were unlocked with an irritated grunt. The young woman rubbed her wrists only once before lifting her eyes to meet his. For the first time, the square became completely silent. Her voice was low, steady, without fear. You'll regret this. A brief pause drifted between them like dust carried by the wind. I won't obey. No pleading. No gratitude. Only a promise. Several men burst into laughter again. See? Told you. Take her back before sunset. Even the auctioneer smirked as he pocketed the coins. Ethan studied her for a long moment. There was anger in her eyes. Pride. Pain buried so deeply it had become part of her breathing. But there was something else. She had expected another owner. She had not expected silence. Ethan finally spoke. Good. She frowned. If obedience was what I wanted, he said quietly, turning toward the waiting horse, I'd have bought another mule. For the first time since the chains had come off, the fierce certainty in the young Apache woman's face faltered, if only for the space of a single heartbeat. Neither of them noticed the 3 riders watching from the shaded porch across the street. Unlike everyone else, they weren't laughing. One of them slowly removed his cigar. Follow them, he muttered. That girl was never supposed to leave this town alive. The ride out of Dry Creek passed in complete silence. The afternoon sun hung low enough to paint the prairie in shades of gold, but neither rider admired it. Ethan kept a steady pace, his old bay gelding moving with the patient rhythm of an animal that had traveled too many lonely miles. Behind him, the young Apache woman rode with her wrists free for the first time in weeks, yet every muscle in her body remained as tense, as if invisible chains still bound her. She never looked at him. She watched the horizon instead. She measured every hill, every creek, every stand of cottonwood trees. Every mile was another chance to escape. Ethan noticed. He said nothing. The wind carried the scent of sagebrush across the open land. Grass whispered beneath the horses' hooves while hawks circled lazily overhead. It should have felt peaceful. Instead, every heartbeat carried suspicion. By sunset, they reached a lonely ranch tucked beneath a ridge of weathered sandstone. A modest cabin stood beside an aging red barn. A split-rail fence enclosed a handful of horses grazing quietly among patches of yellow grass. There were no hired hands, no family waiting on the porch, no barking dogs, only silence. Ethan climbed from the saddle first. This is home. The woman remained mounted. Her eyes searched every window, every shadow, every possible hiding place. Finally, she slid to the ground, landing lightly despite the exhaustion written beneath the bruises on her face. Ethan walked toward the cabin and pushed open the front door. You can come inside. She didn't move. I've slept under enough roofs built by white men. Her voice was calm. I know what happens after the door closes. For several seconds, Ethan simply stood there. Then he nodded once. As you wish. He disappeared into the cabin without another word. The woman frowned. Confusion crept into her guarded expression. Most men argued. Most demanded obedience. Most reminded her they owned her. This one simply walked away. Night settled over the ranch with surprising speed. The air cooled, carrying the smell of dry earth and distant rain somewhere beyond the mountains. Crickets began their endless song while the horses shifted quietly inside the corral. She chose the ground beside the barn, not because she trusted the place, because barns had more than one exit. She wrapped her arms around her knees and stared into the darkness, waiting for footsteps that never came. An hour later, the cabin door opened. Ethan stepped outside carrying a folded wool blanket. He approached only halfway, far enough that she could reach a knife before he could reach her. He laid the blanket on a fence rail. The desert gets cold. I don't need your pity. It isn't pity. He turned back toward the cabin. It's just a blanket. Again, no argument, no orders, only quiet footsteps disappearing inside. The young woman watched the blanket for a long time. Finally, she stood, walked over, and examined it as though it might conceal a trap. Nothing. Just worn gray wool that smelled faintly of cedar smoke. She left it hanging untouched. Long after midnight, the temperature dropped sharply. Wind slipped beneath her thin clothes until her body trembled despite every effort to stay still. Inside the cabin, no light remained. No one came. No one watched. Slowly, almost angrily, she reached for the blanket. She wrapped it around her shoulders, muttering something in Apache beneath her breath that sounded more like surrender than gratitude. Across the dark pasture, hidden among a cluster of juniper trees nearly 200 yards away, 3 riders watched the lonely ranch through the glow of a dying campfire. One of them lowered a brass spyglass. She stayed. Another smiled coldly. Good. The oldest rider adjusted the black glove covering his scarred hand. Let her believe she's safe. He stared toward Ethan's cabin with eyes that held no warmth. When the time comes, we'll kill the rancher first. Morning arrived with frost glittering on the fence rails and sunlight spilling slowly across the prairie. The ranch woke the way it always had, not with voices, but with the scrape of leather, the creak of old wood, and the quiet breathing of horses waiting to be fed. Aiyana had already been awake for an hour. She had barely slept. Every unfamiliar sound had pulled her eyes open. Every gust of wind had reminded her of camps where men smiled by daylight and became monsters after dark. She watched Ethan from the barn doorway. He worked alone. 1 bucket of water, 1 armful of hay, 1 horse at a time. No shouting, no whip. Even the animals followed him because they wanted to. That made less sense to her than anything else. She stepped quietly toward the corral. The gate latch was simple, old, loose. 1 quick movement. The horses burst forward like water breaking through a dam. Hooves thundered across the pasture, sending birds exploding into the pale morning sky. Any other rancher would have cursed, would have run, would have struck the nearest person. Ethan simply looked up from the water trough. He sighed. Well, he picked up his hat from the ground. There goes half my morning. Nothing more. He walked after the horses with the steady patience of a man chasing old friends instead of lost property. Aiyana stood frozen. She had expected rage. Instead, she received disappointment directed at no one. Hours later, Ethan returned with every horse except 1. Dust covered his boots almost to the knees. His shirt clung to his back with sweat. He carried no anger with him, only exhaustion. He placed another log onto the chopping block before glancing toward Aiyana. Breakfast's inside. She crossed her arms. I didn't ask for food. I know. You think feeding me makes me owe you. He split the log cleanly down the middle. No. Every white man wants something. Ethan drove the axe into another piece of wood. Then I must be a poor example. She narrowed her eyes. Why? He stopped swinging for the first time. The axe rested quietly against the stump. My father used to say, he murmured, if kindness comes with a bill attached, it wasn't kindness to begin with. He lifted another log. The conversation ended there. No lecture. No demand that she understand. Only the rhythmic crack of splitting timber echoed across the yard. That afternoon, while Ethan repaired a broken fence on the western pasture, Aiyana slipped into the barn. A saddlebag rested against the wall. Inside lay dried beef, coffee beans, a small revolver, $32 wrapped inside a faded cloth. Enough money for a fresh horse and supplies. Enough to disappear forever. Her fingers closed around the coins. She listened. Nothing. Only the distant tapping of Ethan's hammer. She tucked the money beneath her shirt and quietly led the last remaining horse toward the back gate. Freedom stood only a few steps away. The gelding suddenly stopped. It refused to move. She pulled harder. The animal planted its feet. Behind her came Ethan's calm voice. Old Ranger doesn't like strangers. She spun around. Ethan stood 20 feet away with a coil of fencing wire over one shoulder. He wasn't holding a rifle. His hands weren't even raised. His eyes drifted from the frightened horse to the outline of the stolen coins beneath her shirt. Neither of them spoke. Finally, Ethan reached into his own pocket. He tossed a small leather pouch onto the ground between them. It landed with a soft clink. There's another $20 in there. Aiyana stared at him in disbelief. If you're going to run. His voice remained gentle. Take enough food to survive the mountains. The words struck harder than any slap she had ever received. She could not understand them. She had stolen from him, tried to leave him with nothing. Yet the man she believed would eventually become another owner was quietly offering her more. Hidden beyond the ridge, the three riders watched the exchange through a spyglass. The scarred man smiled without humor. He's making her trust him. Another rider shook his head slowly. No. The scarred man tightened his black glove. He's making our job much harder. The hardest walls to break are never built from stone. They are built from memories that refuse to die. Aiyana did not take the extra $20. She left both the leather pouch and the stolen coins on the barn floor before disappearing into the hills for the rest of the afternoon. When she returned after sunset, everything remained exactly where she had left it. Nothing had been counted. Nothing had been questioned. Ethan was sitting on the porch, repairing an old bridle beneath the fading light. A lantern burned quietly beside him, filling the air with the faint smell of warm oil and leather. He looked up only once. Supper's on the stove. She answered with silence. Again, he returned to his work. That silence bothered her more than shouting ever could. She had spent 3 years learning how men behaved. They bought. They owned. They demanded. Every kindness carried a hidden chain. Every smile became a bargain. Every promise ended with another locked door. The first trader had offered her bread. That night, he sold her to gamblers. The second man had bought her because she knew horses. When she became sick with fever, he traded her for whiskey. The third had smiled the most. He called her daughter whenever strangers were watching. When no one could hear, he reminded her she was worth less than the boots on his feet. The scars beneath the sleeves of her buckskin dress had faded. The memories had not. She stared across the dark yard toward Ethan. Why was he different? Or was he simply more patient? The question refused to leave her. The following morning, thunder rolled over the distant mountains. Heavy clouds swallowed the blue sky, carrying the sharp scent of rain long before the first drop ever touched the earth. Ethan hurried to reinforce the barn doors. The wind was rising. Aiyana noticed one of the younger horses trapped near the western fence, frightened by the approaching storm. Without thinking, she climbed over the rails. The colt kicked wildly. Its lead rope had wrapped tightly around a broken post. She reached for it. The frightened animal jerked backward. The rotten fence collapsed beneath her. Wood splintered. Aiyana crashed hard against the ground as the horse bolted through the opening. Pain shot through her ankle. She tried to stand. Her leg refused. For one terrifying heartbeat, she was back inside another prison, unable to run, waiting for footsteps. They came almost immediately. Ethan sprinted across the pasture through sheets of blowing dust. He dropped beside her without a word. Can you move it? She clenched her jaw. Don't touch me. He stopped instantly. Not because he feared her, because he heard something deeper than anger inside those words. He removed his hat. I'll wait. Rain began falling. Cold. Heavy. The prairie turned gray beneath the storm. Aiyana tried again. The pain was unbearable. She nearly collapsed. Only then did Ethan speak. If I carry you. He looked directly into her eyes. I'll put you down the moment you ask. No bargain. No condition. No ownership. Only a promise. For a long moment she searched his face for the lie. She found none. Very slowly. She nodded once. Ethan lifted her as carefully as someone carrying an injured bird. Not too tightly. Not too loosely. His hands never wandered. His eyes never changed. The rain soaked both of them before they reached the porch. Inside the cabin, he set her gently onto a wooden chair and stepped backward immediately, giving her space she had never expected anyone to offer. He disappeared into another room. When he returned, he carried only a basin of warm water, clean cloth, and strips of fresh bandage. He placed them on the table. You can wrap it yourself. Then he walked outside into the rain again. Aiyana listened to the storm pounding against the roof. She stared at the untouched bandages, then toward the open doorway where Ethan stood beneath the porch roof, repairing the broken saddle instead of watching her. A single thought slipped quietly into her mind. For the first time, she hoped he wasn't pretending. Far beyond the pasture, hidden beneath the storm-dark trees, the scarred rider watched the cabin through the rain. Lightning flashed across his weathered face. He smiled. Good, he whispered. The girl is beginning to doubt her fear. He rested one hand on the rifle across his saddle. And people who start trusting always stop looking over their shoulder. Trust is never born in the moment someone saves your life. It begins the first time they have the chance to hurt you and choose not to. The storm passed before dawn. By morning, the prairie smelled of wet earth and crushed sage. Tiny drops of rain clung to every blade of grass, sparkling beneath the returning sunlight. Aiyana woke to the sound of laughter. Not loud, not cruel, a child's laughter. She slowly stepped onto the porch, favoring her healing ankle. Near the corral, Ethan was kneeling beside a little boy no older than 7. The child held a frightened puppy wrapped inside his jacket while tears streaked through the dust on his face. It ran into the wire, the boy whispered. Ethan examined the animal's bleeding paw. It'll heal. You promise? I don't make promises to children unless I can keep them. The boy smiled. Aiyana watched from the shadows. She had never seen Ethan speak differently to anyone, whether horse, child, or stranger. His voice remained the same, quiet, steady, honest. By noon, the little boy had gone home carrying the sleeping puppy in his arms. The ranch became silent once again. Aiyana found Ethan repairing the western fence. Without speaking, she picked up several loose boards and carried them toward him. He looked surprised, only for a moment. Then he accepted them with a nod. Neither mentioned it. For the next hour they worked side by side beneath the bright sky. Only the sound of hammer blows filled the air. Something strange settled between them. Not friendship, not peace. Something smaller. The absence of hostility. Then the horses suddenly lifted their heads. Every one of them. At the same time. Their ears pointed toward the southern ridge. Ethan stopped hammering. So did you hear it? Aiyana asked quietly. I didn't. I felt it. She pressed one hand against the fence post. The ground. Seconds later, the distant rhythm reached him. Hoofbeats. Fast. More than one rider. Ethan climbed onto the fence for a better view. 3 riders. Exactly as Aiyana had expected. Her face lost every trace of calm. They found me. She stepped backward instinctively. No. They found us. The riders stopped nearly 100 yards from the ranch instead of approaching. Their leader wore a long black coat despite the heat. The scarred man. He removed his hat politely. Afternoon. His voice carried easily across the field. We're looking for a runaway servant. Ethan climbed down from the fence. No servants here. The man smiled. You bought her in Dry Creek. I bought her freedom. A flicker of irritation crossed the stranger's face. You bought stolen property. Ethan rested both hands casually on the fence rail. I don't recall buying property. The rider's smile disappeared. We'll be back with legal papers. You do that. Neither man raised his voice. Neither reached for a gun. The silence between them became heavier than gunpowder. Finally, the scarred rider turned his horse. As they disappeared beyond the ridge, he glanced once over his shoulder. Not at Ethan, at Aiyana. The look froze her blood. She knew it. That was not the face of a man planning a lawsuit. That was the face of someone who buried witnesses. Long after the riders vanished, Ethan remained standing at the broken fence. You knew them? It wasn't a question. Aiyana nodded slowly. They don't sell people. She swallowed hard. They erased them. Ethan looked toward the empty horizon where dust still floated above the trail. Then he quietly walked into the barn. When he returned, he carried the old Winchester rifle hanging above the doorway. He checked the chamber, loaded it, then leaned it beside the front porch. Not in his hands. Within reach. Aiyana stared at him. I thought you didn't want trouble. I don't. Then why keep the rifle? Ethan looked out across the endless prairie where the three riders had disappeared. Because sometimes, his eyes never left the horizon. Peace only survives when evil knows it won't find you unprepared. Hidden several miles away, the scarred rider slowed his horse and looked back one final time. He reached into his saddlebag and unfolded a faded piece of paper bearing a charcoal sketch of a silver pendant. He smiled coldly. The cowboy still has no idea. He folded the paper carefully. Who he paid $2 to save. Sometimes the smallest object carries the weight of an entire forgotten world. The days that followed grew strangely peaceful. Too peaceful. Even the wind seemed to move more quietly across Ethan Walker's ranch, as though the prairie itself were holding its breath. Aiyana noticed the change before Ethan did. Birds that usually nested near the creek had disappeared. The deer trails behind the ridge stood empty. Even the coyotes stopped calling after sunset. Something was driving every living creature away. She mentioned it while Ethan repaired a broken wagon wheel. They're watching. He looked up. The men. She nodded. They're patient hunters. A second before handing her the keys to the storage shed. No warning. No reminder. No request to behave. Just trust. As his horse disappeared beyond the ridge, Aiyana stood alone in the silent yard. It was the first time in years that anyone had willingly left everything they owned in her care. She wandered through the cabin slowly. The place held very little. A wooden table worn smooth by time. An old Bible with cracked leather binding. A harmonica resting beside the window. Family photographs faded almost white. One picture caught her attention. A young girl, perhaps 12 years old, smiling beside a younger Ethan. She carried a silver pendant shaped like a soaring hawk. Aiyana frowned. She had seen that symbol before. Not in the photograph. In stories. Long before the traders came. Before everything was taken. A distant crash interrupted her thoughts. She hurried outside. The barn door swung open violently in the wind. One frightened horse had kicked over a storage chest. Its contents scattered across the floor. She knelt to gather them. Blankets. Rope. Old maps. Then, something wrapped inside a faded blue cloth. She unfolded it carefully. A silver pendant. The same soaring hawk. Its surface had been scratched by years of wear, but the carving remained unmistakable. On the back, almost hidden beneath age, were tiny symbols engraved into the metal. Not English. Apache. Her breathing stopped. She knew those markings. Every child in her village knew them. They belonged to only one family. The Sky River clan. The hereditary protectors chosen to carry peace offerings between neighboring tribes. Very few pendants like this had ever existed. Most had disappeared decades earlier. How could a white rancher possess one? Before she could think further, hoofbeats exploded across the valley. Fast. Urgent. Ethan returned at full gallop. Dust followed him like smoke. He leaped from the saddle before the horse had fully stopped. Inside, his voice was sharper than she had ever heard. She instinctively hid the pendant behind her back. What happened? They weren't waiting for papers. He glanced toward the southern ridge. They burned Jacob Miller's ranch. Aiyana felt. Cold spread through her chest. Jacob lived nearly 10 miles away. Is he? Ethan lowered his eyes. I don't know. The words hung heavily between them. Smoke drifted upward beyond the distant hills. Black against the afternoon sky. Neither of them spoke. Then Aiyana slowly opened her hand. The silver pendant caught the sunlight. Ethan froze. His face lost all color. Where? He stepped closer. Did you find that? In your barn. His eyes remained fixed on the pendant. For a long moment he said nothing. Finally he whispered almost to himself. I thought it was lost forever. Before Aiyana could ask another question, A single rifle shot echoed across the valley. The bullet struck the porch post beside Ethan's head, showering both of them with splinters. Silence vanished. The hunt had begun. Far beyond rifle range, hidden among the rocks, the scarred man lowered the smoking barrel of his long rifle. He smiled as another rider handed him an old, folded document bearing the seal of a tribal council. She found the pendant. The scarred man mounted his horse. Good. He looked toward the distant ranch one final time. Now they'll start asking exactly the questions we've spent 15 years trying to bury. The truth rarely arrives alone. It brings old names, buried promises, and people who never stopped searching. The bullet hole in the porch post remained untouched. Ethan refused to patch it. Why leave it there? Aiyana asked the next morning. He brushed his hand across the splintered wood. So I don't forget they're coming back. The answer lingered between them. Neither mentioned the silver pendant again. Not because they had forgotten. Because both feared what the answers might become. Just after sunrise, another rider appeared. Alone. Unlike the three armed men, this traveler carried no rifle across his saddle. Only a walking staff tied beside an old blanket roll. His horse moved slowly, almost respectfully, toward the ranch. Aiyana stepped onto the porch. The moment she saw the old man's long gray braid and the faded blue paint across his cheekbones, her breathing caught. Elder, she whispered the Apache word before she realized it. The old rider climbed carefully from his horse. His eyes settled first on Aiyana, then on Ethan. Finally, on the silver pendant resting in Ethan's hand. The old man froze. His weathered fingers trembled. Without asking permission, he stepped closer. May I? Ethan placed the pendant into his hands. For a long moment, the elder simply held it against his forehead with closed eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades. I buried this. Neither Ethan nor Aiyana answered. The old man looked at Ethan with quiet disbelief. You are Samuel Walker's son. Ethan blinked. You knew my father? I owed him my life. Silence settled across the porch. The elder slowly lowered himself onto the wooden step. Many winters ago, your father crossed Apache land carrying medicine for settlers trapped by fever. He found our people instead. We had the same sickness. He gave us every bottle and walked away with nothing. Ethan had never heard that story. My father never mentioned it. The elder smiled sadly. Good men seldom do. He turned toward Aiyana. And the pendant? His expression changed completely. This was never meant for a white family. Aiyana's heartbeat quickened. It belonged to the Sky River clan, the guardians of peace. She nodded. I know. The elder looked directly into her eyes. No. You know the stories. I know the truth. He lifted the pendant so sunlight flashed across the ancient engraving. This belonged to your mother. The world seemed to stop breathing. Aiyana stared at him. She entrusted it to Samuel Walker the night your village was attacked. Ethan's eyes widened. My father had it. The elder nodded slowly. He promised to return it when the child was safe. What child? The old man looked gently toward Aiyana. You. Every sound disappeared. Only the wind remained. Aiyana took one uncertain step backward. No. My mother died. She did. The elder's voice softened. But before she died, she placed you into Samuel Walker's arms. Ethan struggled to speak. My father never found her. He didn't. The elder's eyes filled with grief. They took the child before sunrise. The traitors. They murdered everyone who knew. Aiyana felt the porch sway beneath her feet. Her entire life had been built upon fragments. Now even those fragments were breaking apart. The elder closed Aiyana's fingers around the pendant. It has finally come home. At that exact moment, a distant cloud of dust rose beyond the southern ridge. Not 3 riders. Not 5. Dozens. Ethan narrowed his eyes. The old elder looked once toward the approaching horizon. Then his face became pale. They came sooner than I feared. Who? The elder's answer was barely louder than the wind. The men who destroyed your mother's clan. Far across the prairie, the scarred rider lowered his spyglass. Behind him rode more than 20 armed horsemen. He smiled as the ranch slowly grew larger beneath the morning sun. No more secrets. This time, he rested one hand on the butt of his revolver. We bury every witness together. The loudest victories are often the weakest. Real justice arrives so quietly that the guilty hear it only after it is too late. The riders stopped just beyond rifle range. 23 horses, 23 armed men. Not one shouted. Not one reached for a weapon. The scarred leader knew fear traveled farther than bullets. Dust drifted between the two sides like smoke from an invisible fire. Ethan stood beside the porch. His Winchester rested against one shoulder, still lowered. The elder remained seated, his weathered hands folded calmly over his walking staff. Aiyana stepped forward before anyone could stop her. No. Her voice carried across the empty pasture. They came for me. The scarred man smiled. At last. He removed his black gloves one finger at a time. You've grown into your mother's eyes. Aiyana felt her stomach tighten. You knew her. I killed everyone who protected her. The words fell without emotion, as if he were discussing the weather. Ethan's fingers tightened around the rifle. The elder quietly placed one hand on the barrel. Not yet. The old man's eyes never left the riders. They did not come prepared for truth. The scarred leader laughed. Truth? You still think anyone believes old stories? The elder slowly stood. Despite his age, his voice rolled across the prairie with surprising strength. You murdered the Sky River clan. You kidnapped a child. You sold her. You hunted every witness. The riders behind the scarred man shifted uneasily. Several exchanged uncertain glances. One frowned. Another lowered his rifle slightly. The scarred man noticed. Immediately. Lies. He spoke sharply. The old fool protects savages. The elder calmly reached inside his blanket. Not for a weapon. For a weathered leather pouch. He held it high. The peace records. The scarred man's expression changed instantly. For the first time, fear. Real fear. You burned every copy, he whispered. I burned the village. The elder nodded. You forgot the messenger. He opened the pouch. Inside rested folded tribal agreements bearing signatures, seals, and names recognized by both tribal leaders and territorial officials decades earlier. One document carried another signature. Samuel Walker. Ethan stared in disbelief. My father. He witnessed the exchange. The elder unfolded another page. This declares the child under tribal protection. Another. This records the attack. Another. This names every man responsible. Silence spread through the riders. One by one, they looked toward their own leader. The scarred man reached for his revolver. Not to fight, to destroy the evidence. Before his hand touched the grip, a calm voice came from behind him. I wouldn't. Everyone turned. 6 mounted deputy marshals rode slowly over the ridge. Behind them came Judge Elias Whitcomb himself, carrying official warrants. Jacob Miller, the rancher whose home had burned, sat alive in the lead wagon. Bandaged, bruised, but breathing. I survived, Jacob called. And I remembered every face. The scarred man's confidence shattered. His own men backed their horses away. One rider removed his hat. Another quietly dropped his rifle into the dirt. None wanted to die protecting a murderer. The judge unfolded a document. Silas Crow. The scarred man's real name echoed across the valley. You stand accused of murder, kidnapping, human trafficking, arson, and fraud. No one moved. Silas looked around desperately. His army had disappeared without firing a single shot. 23 riders. Now 22 strangers. Justice had already won. He slowly raised both hands. Aiyana watched him carefully. Not with hatred, only with exhaustion. Years of fear suddenly felt heavier than chains. Ethan finally lowered the Winchester completely. It had never fired. The elder smiled quietly. That is how peace was always meant to work. As deputy marshals led Silas Crow away in irons, he looked once more toward Aiyana. His smile was gone forever. You think this ends today? Aiyana closed her fingers around the silver pendant. It ended. She looked toward Ethan standing silently beside her. The moment someone finally chose not to sell me. The prairie fell silent again. Only the wind remained, carrying away the last echo of a war that had ended without a single gunshot. Some people spend their whole lives trying to discover what freedom is worth. Aiyana already knew. It was worth far more than $2 silver. Summer slowly gave way to autumn. Golden grass rolled across the prairie beneath a softer sun, and the ranch that had once felt like a prison became a place where silence no longer carried fear. The bullet hole remained in the porch post. The broken fence had long since been repaired. The horses grazed peacefully once again. Life had returned, but it was not the same life. Silas Crow and the surviving members of his gang were convicted before the territorial court. The old tribal records, Samuel Walker's signature, Jacob Miller's testimony, and the elder's witness left no room for doubt. For the first time in many years, the truth was stronger than money. The judge ordered every illegal sale erased from the record. Every surviving victim was declared free. No newspaper called it a miracle. Those who had lived through it knew better. It was simply justice. Arriving late, one quiet evening, the elder prepared to leave. His horse waited patiently beneath the cottonwood tree. He looked toward Aiyana. "The council has asked you to return." She stood silently beside the porch. "My people still remember your mother's name. You belong with them." Aiyana lowered her eyes. Then she looked toward Ethan. He was repairing a saddle near the barn, pretending not to listen. The elder smiled gently. "A home is not always the place where you were born. It is the place where your soul finally stops running." He mounted his horse. Without another word, he disappeared into the endless prairie. Several days later, Aiyana walked into the old barn carrying a small cloth pouch. Inside rested 2 worn silver coins, the same $2 Ethan had paid at the auction. She placed them carefully on the workbench. Ethan looked up. "I don't owe you anything." "I know." She pushed the coins toward him anyway. "I want them back where they belong." He stared at the silver for a long moment. Then he quietly closed her fingers around them. "No." She frowned. "You keep them. They remind me of the worst day of my life." He shook his head gently. "They should remind you of the first day it changed." Neither of them smiled. Neither needed to. The evening breeze carried the smell of dry grass through the open barn doors while sunlight settled softly across the weathered wood. Aiyana slipped the 2 coins into the same leather pouch that now held her mother's silver pendant. One represented everything that had been stolen. The other, everything that had been returned. Months later, travelers passing through Dry Creek often noticed something unusual about the lonely ranch beneath the sandstone ridge. A white rancher worked the fields. An Apache woman rode beside him. No chains, no fear, no explanation. The curious always asked the same question. Did he really buy her for $2? Old Jacob Miller would simply lean back in his chair outside the general store and answer without looking up. No, he paid $2. But he spent every day afterward proving she had never belonged to anyone. As the years passed, the story drifted farther than the prairie winds. Some people remembered it as a tale about an auction. Others remembered it as the downfall of a notorious criminal. But the elder told it differently whenever children gathered around the evening fire. He would hold up a small silver coin and say, "Never judge the value of a soul by the price someone once paid for it." Then he would fall silent. Because silence, after all, was where the lesson lived. And somewhere beneath another western sunset, Ethan Walker and Aiyana stood side by side outside the old ranch house, watching their horses disappear into fields glowing gold beneath the fading light. No vows were spoken. No promises were made. The wind carried enough of both. Out there, justice had never needed the loudest gun. It only needed one man willing to see a human being where everyone else saw a price, and one woman brave enough to believe him.